Today's video has been sponsored by Sins of a Solar Empire 2, which is releasing on Steam this summer. This sequel to one of the best space strategy games of all time brings back the TEC, Versari and Advent to battle over moving solar systems with deep real-time strategy gameplay. Engage creative new strategies to defeat opponents in an ever-changing landscape where the planets actually orbit stars. On the battlefield, a detailed combat simulation lets you protect weaker ships by body-blocking missiles, or outpace slow turrets with speedy strike forces. Or you can just become an economic powerhouse and outproduce everyone. Just like its predecessors, the game will be fully moddable and will even include an in-game mod browser, which is also fully integrated into the up to 10-player multiplayer matches, automatically keeping everybody synced together so you can spend more time blowing spaceships up. Wishlist Sins of a Solar Empire 2 on Steam for its summer release by clicking the link in the description and pinned comment below. Hello everybody and welcome back to Spacedock. I'm Joanna and today we'll be doing a broad overview of the way you might build a navy. Another way to think about it is what ship types would you include in a fleet? To start with, you need a good set of big ships that form the heart of the whole navy. These are the capital ships, the ones that lead a fleet or battle group. What these big ships are is setting dependent, but the general ubiquity of fighters in sci-fi does make carriers or battle carriers an extremely common choice for this role, much like in real life. If battleships are still present, then of course they can be the heart instead of or as well as carriers, and may be paired up with one in a battle group. You can of course go much larger than these ships, as sci-fi often does, into the realm of titans, dreadnoughts and super duper carriers, and such vessels are often equivalent to an entire battle group by themselves. The downside is that these huge ships can only be in one place at once, and are a vast investment in resources and manpower. That latter point may lead to them being stuck in Spacedock much of the time, since they're simply too costly to actually use, much like the old first-rate ships of the line in the Age of Sail. In Star Sector, capital ships are generally slow and tough, so often form a sort of anchor for their fleets, defining the front lines of a battle with smaller, faster ships maneuvering around them. It works great in the game, but in real life and other fiction, larger ships may actually be some of the fastest in a fleet, simply because they can fit really big power plants and engines that scale up in capability really well. Supporting and protecting the capital ships is going to be the job of a whole variety of medium-sized ships, cruisers and destroyers and frigates and the like, things equipped with powerful sensors and electronic warfare suites, or that are festooned with defensive weaponry for taking on fighters or missiles. These medium-sized escorts can also act on their own or form up into a smaller group to go do a task that doesn't require the huge investment that is a carrier group, so often these ships end up being the true workhorses of a navy. The smaller ships here, things sized around frigates and below, often have the range, speed and operational freedom that makes them suitable for long-range scouting. Depending on the FTL method of assetting, and if there's FTL communications, these smaller ships may also be required to be pickets. They would be early warning vessels, spotting incoming enemies and then being a messenger for that information. Something else to consider is that going completely insane with how many ship types there are may not be wise. Less is more. Having a nice balance of ship types can provide variety without going completely overboard into the slop zone where everything starts blending into one another because they're just too similar to each other. Having fewer designs also means that those ships can be really well refined. All the gremlins can be worked out of the systems and the weird oddities found. The sort of thing that O'Brien did to the Defiant when it was actually able to be used rather than being stuck mothballed somewhere. If you had to split that energy over several distinct and competing hull types, each separate one wouldn't get anywhere near the same amount of care and attention. In some ways, having lots of unrefined ship types like that skips the procurement process that is supposed to cut multiple options down to one. But maybe that's the whole vibe you're going for. There might be no time to do a full process, but you got these ship designs here and they look alright, so build them! We need a fleet! Which brings us around to the entire other way of making a navy, the messy, disorganized and at times chaotic route that nations without their own mature and well-developed defense industries end up using in real life. Maybe they don't have any defense industry, or one that's dramatically smaller than their current needs, causing them to rely entirely on being given whatever they can get, which is often the outdated leftovers from some other nation. But such a hodgepodge fleet comes with many trade-offs. Each ship class will have its own maintenance and spare parts needs, or require entirely different ammunition types for its weapons. Luckily, it is possible to jerry-rig things together, doing things like fitting missiles or torpedoes in or on vessels that weren't built with them in mind. The end result of this is a very characterful, if slightly ramshackle set of ships with loads of cross-compatibility, capable of equipping nearly anything the crews can get their hands on. Going even further down that train of thought, and perhaps a setting or a faction within it doesn't even have set-in-stone ship classes. They may instead be cobbling together whatever works, either from scratch or by converting civilian vessels into warships. Or perhaps ship production is really spread out, or is in a weird experimental phase where every dockyard is making their own thing. Sort of like the interwar or early World War II tank building, where no one knew what was going on or what to make, but something had to be built right now. Another way to end up with a fleet more chaotic than a child's bag of pick and mix is including a wide range of ship ages. Any fleet that doesn't appear from thin air overnight is going to naturally have a mix of new and old vessels, including some in the exact same role. Ships do take a decent amount of time to be built after all, so you can't just immediately replace, say, an old destroyer class overnight. You also can't retire every single ship in an obsolete class in one go, because that leaves a capability gap while the replacement ships are still being built. You have to phase out the old ones while the new ones come online. With all that said, Star Trek still probably takes it a touch too far with the apparent obligation for every show or movie to create its own set of vessels. But there is at least a potential excuse in Star Trek that stems from the Federation being a bit of a utopia. The engineers just have time and resources to design whatever they want. Then industrial replicators can churn it out easy peasy, like giant usable art projects. It's probably the same sort of deal with all the different uniforms everywhere. Something else that Trek seems to be doing is refitting old ships up to new standards. I mean, there has to be a reason a Miranda hull lasts so long, right? And this does happen constantly in real life too. After all, it's far cheaper to update a mostly fine ship than to design and build a whole new class. Stargate is a great example of this, as various ships are shown improving over time. The most obvious of this is the Towery's two ship classes, the Prometheus and Daedalus. Prometheus is practically a testbed for hyperdrive tech with how often it breaks down and needs a new one installed, and the Daedalus spec gets constant improvements over time, ending up with some of the most capable shields and weapons of anyone. And it's not just the Towery that improve their fleets. The Goa'uld Hatak gets its own improvements as the series goes on, most notably from Anubis' forbidden knowledge. Something else that could be done is altering an old ship that's past its prime, or turning something legally not allowed anymore into something new. Like converting an obsolete destroyer into a tender, or making a frigate out of a Razade down ship of the line, or turning an old carrier into a freighter, that sort of stuff. There's no point wasting a perfectly good hull, and for some factions lacking resources, this sort of recycling may be a requirement. Which brings us to auxiliary ships, an often overlooked element of any fleet that also absolutely needs to be there. Ships may need long-term resupply to stay on mission without needing to return to port, so auxiliaries bring them food, water, fuel, and maybe even ammunition. Mobile repair ships would also be something interesting to include, along with some tugs dedicated to military use. Certainly, many of these tasks can be achieved by contracted civilian vessels, but a large and established navy will have its own ships on hand at all times. There's also going to be a need for troop carriers and landing craft, either specialised for vacuum or atmosphere, or just good at both. And mine layers, rescue ships, just all sorts of extras that fulfill absolutely vital logistics roles to keep the warships in the action. But that's not all. There's also the possibility of much smaller craft and all the varied tasks they can fulfill. Beyond the obvious things like fighters and such, there's small cargo craft for mail and low-volume supplies, shuttles for transferring crew, and really any specialist auxiliary role. Battlestar Galactica's Raptors are a great example because they're multi-role, performing electronic warfare, early warning and control, search and rescue, and of course mundane shuttle tasks. There are a myriad of ways to compose a fleet. You can do a clean and tidy, by-the-book style with a well-defined set of ships, or you can smush together something very messy, or a mix of the two, as is often the case in real life. Whatever you choose, the composition of a navy is a brilliant way of showcasing the type of faction it represents, their history, current situation, and resources available to them. You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our frigate and spacefighter design reference books. Alternatively, you can support us directly through YouTube by becoming a channel member. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.